Thank you very much, Emma. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time out to have a listen to this over lunch. Hope you're sitting comfortably and sandwiches and coffee at hand. The draft building safety bill, in terms of the title of the presentation, it is a bit odd for me in terms of my training and presentations and eye contact with the audience and engagement, etc. But as I'm sure we've all become very used to Teams, Zoom calls, etc. I will be going through a number of slides. I don't generally try and read slides to you, so I think we're going to have questions at the end, so do sort of raise any questions. If there are any immediate, I don't understand what that means on that slide. If I don't know if they can flag those to you, Emma, and you can stop me if there is something that's not understood on a slide per se. But hopefully it is fairly easy to understand as I go through. So without further ado, in terms of what I am here to cover, a little bit about Ridge in terms of our background and what we do, etc., and how I sit within the partnership and our team, etc. And then really getting into the meat of the draft building safety bill. Now, obviously, the bill has been around for some time, published in July of last year. So I'm probably assuming that a lot of people will have some understanding of what's in that bill. So my aim is really just to sort of refresh, point out relevant aspects and highlight some of the practical impacts that the bill may have once enacted. So that's sort of the agenda, and I'll be running through sort of all those items, but when we get to the sort of penultimate bullet point around what's next for stakeholders, etc., happy for both sort of comments, observations, etc. So I'll get started in terms of just a little bit of background in terms of where I come from. So for those of you who haven't come across Ridge & Partners, we are based, our HQ is in Woodstock, so we're in the grounds of Blenheim Palace, converted cow yards. There's some details in terms of what we do, but essentially property and construction consultants, so many surveyors, engineers, fire safety specialists, and various other disciplines as well. In terms of where I sit within the property consultancy team, we are a specialist consultancy team who predominantly deal with the affordable housing sector. So we work for local authorities, housing associations, etc. So a lot of my interest and need to be sort of involved and understand the impacts of the bill come from the requirements of those clients in terms of those with high risk residential buildings. I have also spent some time immediately in the aftermath of Grenfell working for the Kensington and Chelsea's TMO, which then became part of the council. So in the aftermath of Grenfell, involved in trying to assist and find information around the tower, what work had been carried out, etc. So not the most enjoyable experience, but a good experience in terms of knowledge and understanding. So I look after our team that does sort of large-scale stock condition surveys, etc., and have over more recent years been doing a lot more on the investigation into cladding, insulation types, fire risk assessments, opening up and intrusive works, etc. So that's probably a little bit about Ridge and gives you a bit of context in terms of where we come from and what we do. In terms of the background to the bill itself, you'll all obviously be very aware of the tragedy and the resulting Hackett report. And since then, there has been a number of other sort of documents, guidance, changes in building regulations, and other reports, etc. One of the key things you'll be aware of is the golden thread within the Hackett report, which was really around the information that's provided about a building and how that must be maintained and evidenced to keep residents safe in buildings. As well as the actual building safety bill, it's also important to remember that the fire safety bill is also being introduced to provide some further clarity around the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. So in terms of listening to what the Building Safety Bill has to say, it's also it'd be important to align with the requirements of that Fire Safety Bill and potential overlap in terms of them addressing similar issues. So definitely both to be kept an eye on in terms of how they progress. So that's sort of the background and the catalyst for the bill. So in terms of the bill itself, it's probably the biggest overhaul in 40 odd years in terms of health and safety in construction. It's currently very much focused on probably new residential high risk buildings. But it's expected that over time there will be a phasing to include other high-risk buildings, which will be prescribed by the Secretary of State, etc. The potential impact, and I'm presuming we've probably got those who are involved in asset management, those who are portfolio owners, managers, etc., landlords, etc. The potential impact estimated about 13,000 buildings in England. So quite wide-ranging. I think whilst at the moment there's obviously that focus on high-rise buildings such as Grenfell, providing multi-occupied residential accommodation. But it's important to note that the draft Building Safety Bill does apply to all buildings, or will apply to all buildings of a certain sort of designation and risk. So that doesn't mean necessarily it's going to be all about residential. That could include retail, commercial, warehousing, etc., depending on the risk type. So it is, whilst it's very much my focus within the affordable housing sector, it's not all about housing and high-rise towers. The Building Safety Bill does represent a sort of wholesale regulatory reform for building control as well. And I'll talk a bit more about building control later on and how that's being unified and the role of the regulator. I'll come on to that in a moment. But the bill itself, quite lengthy. It's about 334 pages in total, and I think there's over 150 pages of guidance, but likely to have a fairly significant impact on building owners, leaseholders, other stakeholders, etc. It's obviously important to note that other health and safety legislation and things like CDM regulations, Health and Safety at Work Act, etc., all remain obviously in place. This isn't intended to replace any of those items, but I'll talk a little bit about CDM and potential impacts on related duty holders, particularly in respect of new build. Although I tend to deal with existing properties myself, but I'll cover that in brief. So its aims, as you've probably now read in terms of what Robert Jenrick said at the time, a lot of focus around accountability, responsibility and competency, and bottom line, obviously, safer homes for residents. So that's the sort of the key elements, which is provided an overview in part 1 of the draft bill. So if we move on now to higher risk buildings, you may be aware that previously we were tending to refer to high risk residential buildings, so HRRBs as we used to know them before the draft bill came out, and that residential part of the title has been dropped, just to reflect that we are talking more about all buildings, etc. So in terms of defining those higher risk buildings, as you can see from the slide, we still have reference to the 18 metres or more above ground floor level, finished floor level, as defined and set out with approved document B, or the building contains more than 6 stories. ignoring any below ground level. So again, that's reverting back to the driver in terms of height, which was really the maximum reach of fire brigade's attendants in terms of being able to access a building. So anything over the length that the fire engines can reach becoming higher risk. So as well as satisfying those height conditions, there's some other aspects there on the sort of top left-hand corner of the slide in terms of occupation types and dwellings. There's also some exclusions in terms of things like rooms in residential care homes, prisons, detention centres, temporary accommodation, etc. So they are the definitions. I think in terms of other prescribed definitions or descriptions of high risk buildings, that will be for the Secretary of State to advise on those, and obviously the expectation is that the descriptions will get broader to encompass more and more buildings, so not just focusing on the sort of high-rise residential. So in terms of that's a sort of definition of the types of buildings that that we're looking at. So we'll come on to in terms of practical steps. I guess the first question then people have to ask themselves is do they think they have any high risk buildings? And then if you do, we'll come on to well, what should we be doing next? The draft bill also sees the introduction of a new building safety regulator, which is a new division within the HSE with a national role. And as you'll see from the slide there, they have various roles, responsibilities, etc., particularly in respect of higher risk buildings. So they will be ultimately responsible for making sure that the new ones are built, designed and built safely, and have the necessary information to allow them to be maintained going forward. They have some very specific authorization in terms of allowing works to proceed, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the gateway certifications that will be required. Also the ability to have issue non-compliance or stop notices, and indeed replace some fire safety professionals if they're deemed not to be up to scratch. It is the regulator's role is an oversight of building safety and performance for all higher risk buildings, and will cascade down also in terms of unifying the building control profession. So the regulator will be the building control authority for HRBs, but will also have an overseeing role over all building control professionals. So that's that sort of unifying point on the right hand side there, about on the middle row. There's also the provisions for being able to collate the building safety information, which I'll come on to in a lot more detail, and also the 3 committees that are listed there, which are about promoting safe working practices, sharing ideas, ensuring that appropriate materials are authorised and allowed, and things like flammable cladding and insulation products, etc., don't get used. But also a key thing coming from the Hackett report, and obviously the feedback from the Grenfell Residents Association, was that lack of voice and not listening to residents, and not taking on board their comments and concerns. So there is, as you'll see later, there's more on that, and resident engagement as well. So that very quickly is the building safety regulator. They will be required to report in a strategic plan to the Secretary of State the manner in which they undertake their role, and provide an annual report about the information provided under the mandatory reporting requirements. So that's the role of the regulator in brief. In terms of part 3 of the draft bill, there are also some changes in terms of the Building Act, and particularly around the duty holders and requirements to demonstrate competency in terms of those that they appoint or employ to discharge both design and safe maintenance and running of these high risk buildings. The duty holders' responsibilities and a gateway system for approval I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. But the competency requirements and being able to evidence that you've checked competency requirements will be industry wide, so it won't just be in respect of HRBs. As I mentioned earlier, building inspectors and building controls officers will all be under the remit of the regulator in terms of register and competency requirements. As I said, the regulator will itself take the role of building control for new HRBs. In terms of the information thread, the golden thread that I mentioned at the start, a key theme of the Hackett report, etc. There are proposed a number of milestones which will be introduced through legislation. Obviously, as an industry, we're quite used to working with various gateways in terms of project management and approaches to construction projects, etc. But the ones of particular interest in terms of Gateway 2 and 3, so the end of design and then the end of construction phases, are the requirements for certification to be submitted in respect of higher risk buildings to the regulator, and that these will need to be accompanied by declarations from both the principal designer and the principal contractor in terms of adherence. So those are coming, and I think in terms of projects that people may have currently underway, a review of those sort of Gateway 3 requirements in terms of end of construction is probably a sensible thing to be doing at this stage to understand the sort of level of information, etc., that will be required for that certification prior to occupancy. The likelihood in terms of current projects and new projects with these gateway requirements is likely that there'll be an impact on the scope of services, certainly for the professional teams, and by that in terms of principal designers, principal contractors, but also the likes of employers, agents, contract administrators, etc., understanding what those requirements are likely to be and acting now in terms of getting that sort of information together. There have been various estimates in terms of how this could impact programs for delivery. Obviously, with the requirements to get that certification at Gateway 2 and 3, though time will need to be allowed for obtaining those, and obviously the cost impacts of having them prepared and having that sort of information ready. So they are quite important. I think in terms of the timescale for this, we're probably expecting a period of 12 to 18 months before that sort of Gateway 3 requirement comes into force. But obviously something that if we're in the middle of a program or about to start a new program, it's worth starting to think about that sort of thing now rather than further down the line when it becomes mandatory. Also worth bearing in mind, obviously, in terms of the requirements for those certifications and sign-off and submissions, as well as reviewing the schedule of scope of services provided by various parties, also the associated impacts on professional indemnity insurance. And those same principles will probably also apply in terms of refurbishment projects as well, in terms of how they are designed for HRBs where that's undertaken. The bill also, in terms of after construction and into the occupations phase, establishes this role of an accountable person, who could be a person, individual, or corporate entity, and their responsibility for maintaining the safety of the higher risk building as it goes into occupancy. There is due to be some further guidance around this sort of thing, but there are defined obligations for the accountable person in the draft bill, and I've highlighted down the right hand side of this slide those key elements. The safety case reports I'll talk about in a bit more detail in terms of what's envisaged and would be included within those. And there's obviously a sort of development and enhanced requirement from the health and safety files, O&M manuals, etc. Also, the former safety certificates now been replaced by the building assurance certificates. The accountable person must appoint the building safety manager, which is probably someone whose role you've heard about. Whether this is a single individual or the role is split between a technical and a residential liaison type person, etc. I'm certainly seeing signs of that happening in the affordable housing sector. But the building assurance certificates have to be accompanied by the safety case report, as well as some of the other mandatory reporting requirements, etc. The accountable person also needs to develop that resident engagement strategy that I mentioned. So it's very much partly about technical and achieving safety, both in terms of fire and structure. It is important to emphasise it's not all about fire; it is structural safety as well, but also that residents engagement aspect and keeping residents informed. So that's the role of the accountable person. As I mentioned, the safety case reports requirement again. So pulling together the information and evidence to show that the risks are being proactively managed and mitigating actions have been taken both in design and construction to ensure that the building is safe for residential occupation. In terms of the types of information down the right hand side, there is an expectation, I think, within the industry that the levels of information, the golden thread, and the information that would need to feed into safety cases and be able to be evidenced to the regulator are likely to be around sort of BIM level 2 in terms of expectations, so 3D modeling, etc. This therefore sort of will supplement what we already have in terms of health and safety files under CDM, O&M manuals, etc., and all the other sort of items that I've listed down there, including fire risk assessments of more of an intrusive type 4 than others. So I think the estimate to the industry in terms of the costs of getting us to level 2 outputs have been anything between £250,000 and £500,000 a year, with costs of between 42 and 65k per building to be able to get this sort of level of information together. So not only costs but also the resources, etc., to get this information pulled together. As I said earlier, there's likely to be a delegation period in terms of how long we have it to sort of lead in to provide this sort of information in terms of occupation and Gateway 3 requirements. That's could be sort of 12 to 18 months. But it's obviously a time now to be thinking about these types of information and the level of detail that's likely to be required to satisfy the regulator and obtain those building assurance certificates. I mentioned there are also resident responsibilities. So we've got that resident engagement strategy that's required, but it's also recognised, and certainly from my work in affordable housing, undertaking large-scale stock condition surveys and looking at things like health and safety rating system reviews. We often come across issues also when we do fire risk assessments in terms of fire safety equipment, etc. may be all well, but we have stored materials, people not using their property appropriately. So there is within the bill requirements and updates to the Landlord and Tenant Act and express duties on the residents of higher risk buildings to do those things that don't hinder a building safety manager's role or compromise the fire safety measures that have been incorporated. There are also regimes for recharging tenants in terms of building safety costs, which has created some debate in itself in terms of carrying out building safety work. Obviously quite high profile generally in terms of the work that's been undertaken on cladding to buildings at the moment, both ACM and other combustible materials, and the impacts that potentially has on leaseholders in terms of recharge, etc. So very much a sort of a hot topic at the moment in terms of how that can be afforded and funded. So overall, residents very much a key item within the draft bill, and making sure that they are both considered, but also recognising they also have obligations to help this process. In terms of the impacts of any sort of failures by duty holders, these can be criminal offences, and there are a number of sort of fairly severe punishments for not meeting obligations or potentially not complying with what's currently the bill, and when it becomes an act. I put up there just reference to the Corporate Manslaughter Act of 2007, and I think it is an expectation that things like fees for intervention and fines linked to business turnover levels, etc., are likely to be adopted as sanctions for failing to comply with the Building Safety Act as it will come. So it can have a significant impact if found not to be satisfy those obligations. So important to act now and get things in place so as to be sort of be prepared and obviously try and avoid any interventions or certainly fines, etc., from the regulator. The bill also introduces the new Homes Ombudsman. So there for complaints that can be made, issue a guidance regarding insurance and also identification of designated products, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, in terms of how we used to be about things like asbestos, we're probably now in a similar place with things like ACM and combustible cladding and insulation materials, etc. Also note there, in terms of the bill does also amend the Architects Act of 97 in terms of monitoring competence of architects in line with the new regime. In terms of duty holders, I did mean to just mention that we are quite familiar obviously with the CDM regulations in terms of responsibilities for particularly the client, principal designer and principal contractors. So I think there is an expectation that those requirements, competencies, etc., are going to need to be enhanced in line with the requirements of the draft bill and the needs for those sort of gateway 2 and 3 requirements and provision of information to the regulator. So in terms of, that's sort of a very quick overview of the draft bill. So there's an awful lot in there. In terms of, okay, so that's all very well and good, but what do we do next? So in terms of stakeholders, I'm thinking landlords, portfolio owners, facilities managers, surveyors, consultants, contractors, etc. there is a wide-ranging impact on a number of different parties in the construction supply chain. But Dame Judith Hackett said, basically, as you can read there, it's a sort of get on with it type message. Don't necessarily wait for the draft bill to become enacted. So there's no need to wait. Obviously, enactment will depend on available parliamentary time. With COVID, Brexit, etc., still very much taking up a lot of time. Then obviously, it may happen during the course of this year. I think that's the expectations within 2021, but it may not then sort of be fully into on the statute books to take effect until 2022. But we'll just have to wait and see how that progresses. There's also a number of other supporting secondary legislation, guidance notes, and other procedures that also need to be set up to allow the requirements of the Act to actually function. So they will no doubt be pulled together during the course of this year. So in terms of next steps, I mean, the key thing for stakeholders is really around a fairly sort of common sense question of knowing what you've got and what potential risk you have. So a lot around data, being someone who looks at large scale stock condition surveys, FRAs, etc. It is surprising perhaps how little information many landlords had around the time of Grenfell. And there was definitely a bit of a scrambling to understand potential liabilities, where those high-rise buildings were, how they were constructed, when were they last tested, has strengthening work been undertaken, etc. There were a whole myriad of questions, and whilst Grenfell was several years ago now, we are still finding those same questions and those same issues cropping up with portfolios and property. So the starting point really, it's all about is getting prepared, reviewing status of information, understanding where you may have, if not necessarily high risk residential multi-occupied buildings at the moment, the sort of 6-story 18-meter plus type buildings, but understanding that over time, as I've said, it will be cascaded down to other types of buildings. So not as many stories, some of the higher risk complex buildings, etc. So it's really doing that sort of diagnostic and sort of review of stock and understanding potentially where those risks could be, and therefore ascertaining what information is you have available, or what information you may need to go and collect or undertake more detailed tests, etc. So I've listed down there a number of different types of information or activities. Certainly we're involved in probably all of those in terms of collating further information, putting that together, assessing it, and determining the priorities and what sort of information is missing, and sort of the gap analysis of where sort of further investigation or intrusive works are required. Historically, trying to find as-built drawings and details of existing buildings is often quite a difficult task, and certainly in terms of collation of things like BIM level 2 information, unless you've got relatively newly built stock, that's going to be quite a challenge in some cases. Other aspects, do you have potential higher risk buildings? Important to remember, it's about fire and structural safety, so it's not all about fire risk assessments, etc. So, for example, we've done several investigations in terms of large panel system type buildings, so the Ronan type disproportionate collapse type buildings. There are still instances that we have come across where either strengthening work hasn't been undertaken or has been undertaken but actually isn't sufficient. So identifying those high risk buildings and investigating the information that's available. Type 4 FRAs for this type of buildings, absolutely essential. Can't expect to be able to have a good understanding of fire risks on buildings of this nature if you've only had a type 1 done, for example. So there are a number of potential questions around the higher risk buildings, identifying them and determining what further information may be required. There are also some other sort of issues to flag up. I think these have come particularly from some of the early adopters who've been sort of trialing the principles of the bill before the draft bill was published, and one of those which was mentioned by a number of those in the scheme was that safety culture change. And really having that embedded within an organization all the way through is really critical. So, safety is not all about the principal designer or your CDM, health and safety advisors, etc. It's got to flow through the entire organization, whether you're a consultant or a contractor. So, the days of the joiner going on site and doing their usual job that they've been doing for the last 30-40 years actually is going to need further training and understanding about safety in these types of building where they're working on higher risk buildings. So getting ahead of the curve, as I've said, obviously looking at that culture, making it sort of a golden thread within an organization and a core understanding. Obviously there are specifics in terms of the appointments or under recognizing who the accountable person could be, whether that's individual, corporate body, the requirement for the appointment of building safety managers, and then just listed there some of the other things that we would expect need to be considered in getting ready for the draft bill becoming enacted. In terms of existing new builds, I mentioned consideration of adopting the Gateway 3 certification process and whether that could be looked at and determined what information is likely to be needed, and doing that in anticipation of then being required to provide that at a later stage, just putting you in a better position, much easier to get this type of information during the construction process than it is when everyone's forgotten about it, moved on from the defects liability period and on to the next project. So thinking about that sort of thing now. I mentioned the scope and the competency requirements for principal designers, principal contractors, understanding their requirements, particularly around Gateway 2 and 3 certification, and getting that information together for the safety case reports. It's likely, or very, very likely, the processes are going to have an impact on both costs and time in terms of pulling information together, but also those certification requirements to the regulator. So they are going to have some impact on those sort of project costs and timelines. I think it's probably covered those bits. Just some other sort of final considerations in terms of next steps. There are obviously significant potential implications for leaseholders. As I mentioned, particularly in the provisions that are allowed for the reclaim of building safety related works and associated costs. So that is already an issue in terms of some of the cladding renewal work that's going on. Impacts in terms of mentioned additional costs, whether they're capital or operational cost impacts from the bill, and just set a number of other sort of points there in terms of other things to consider. I think obviously we are dealing with this at the same time as we are also setting objectives for achieving net zero carbon. Some clients aiming for 2030, the longer term deadline of 2050. but obviously thinking about maybe planned works, reinvestment works, etc., and measures being undertaken to achieve net zero carbon. Don't think about those just in isolation, but also think about potential impacts on building safety and fire. So, for example, the phasing out of gas by 2025 in terms of putting any new dwellings on gas supplies. With that disappearing, you know, out a potential risk in terms of gas within a residential building. Yeah, don't think about those things in isolation. I keep going on about evidence and the golden thread and information. Having that information and being able to provide it. One of the big issues around previous fires, etc., has just not been able to find the information relating to construction and what materials were actually used. And we've obviously seen within the Grenfell inquiry a lot of sort of debate around materials used, why were they used, who signed them off, what certification did they have, etc., etc. So having that sort of stuff well documented and evidenced and being able to provide that to a regulator for a high risk building will be critical. There's also quite a significant, I guess, concern around the skills gap. So I've started seeing sort of over the last year or so the adverts going out for building safety managers, etc. And obviously there's training and competency requirements that will need to be addressed within organisations. There are some guidance and competency guides for building safety managers which have been published. So Construction Industry Council and some other accreditations coming from the BSI. But we can't underestimate that a building safety manager isn't going to be caretaker plus. It is going to be someone with a good technical understanding of a building. So FM manager type plus with a increased responsibility in terms of the managing maintenance and evidencing of looking after a building in a safe manner. So that is quite significant in terms of I think they are going to become like rocking horse proverbial in terms of when everyone starts trying to find building safety managers. And that's also been evidenced in terms of the roles of principal designers, etc., and wanting to increase the sort of level of service they now provide and associated costs and the PI liabilities for undertaking a more enhanced role. Mustn't forget about procurement. Impacts on that in terms of obviously the specification and obtaining the right quality of materials and appropriately designed, etc. So there is an impact of this bill all the way down the supply chain, and how that influences what's actually incorporated into higher risk buildings, how they're designed, how they're procured and constructed, etc. So quite wide ranging. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of the Act and a refresh if you'd already obviously read the draft bill when it came out last year, but also hopefully some pointers in terms of practical steps in terms of how you can start looking at being prepared for this and having that transparency of information that's auditable and can demonstrate compliance. So I think that's probably enough from me. I'll hand back to Emma. My contact details are there should you be short on time or have any questions, or indeed want to speak separately about anything that I've mentioned here, or indeed the work that Ridge are doing in this particular arena. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. There are a couple of questions. The first one from David is, please can you expand on the implications for leaseholding landlords and tenants, especially in relation to the current cladding issue?
Okay, there are within the draft bill, there are specific definitions of sort of duty holders and responsibilities. The leaseholder aspect I was talking about there is in relation to certainly in the affordable housing sector, where we've got right to buys or right to acquires, shared ownership, etc. The liability on those leaseholders to have to contribute towards building safety related costs, so recharges, etc. In terms of the other responsibilities in terms of leaseholders, it will depend on the specific provisions within lease agreements with landlords, etc., and therefore where the liability sits. Because if there are express provisions within a lease with the responsibility on the leaseholder, then those requirements outlined in the draft bill would sit with that party. But it may be something that's a bit more specific to the lease itself, and may indeed, I'm obviously not a lawyer by background, but may need some legal advice in terms of, right, well, where does the buck stop with this and whose responsibility is it?
Okay, thank you. One more question that's just disappeared. Hang on. Going forward, is this likely to also apply to historic buildings, especially those that have been converted into residential, e.g. using historic mills converted into flats?
Potentially, I mean, it will be open to the level of risk, really. So I think there is an expectation that more complex buildings and those with particularly sort of higher risk type residents might fall under those categories. So there's no, it's something that will be prescribed by the Secretary of State. So obviously at the moment, there's the big focus is on the high-rise multi-occupied buildings. But I can see that will cascade over time down to other types of multi-occupied buildings. So I would guess in time, yes, but not immediate.
Okay, thank you. That seems to be the only two questions. You've obviously done a very thorough job. Thank you. As Stuart has said in the chat, that this will be available. I think he's going to pop it on YouTube. But if you want a copy of it, then anybody can let me know and I can send it over. And again, thank you very much, Mark, for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure, and I hope you all found that useful and not death by PowerPoint. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been nice to have a quick chat with you all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.